Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of what will be the last cluster of lectures we're going to have for this block. And this is quite a hefty lecture, but we'll be mainly be talking about generalities, um, about neoplastic processes. So for this session, we'll be talking about different terms um, that pertain to neoplastic growths, to tumors. We'll be classifying them into different groups based on behavior, based on um, the cell of origin. Okay, and we'll be talking about how they are named. There are lots of tumors that have been identified, and they have specific naming systems. We're going to talk about how they are named in very broad terms, and then finally we'll be talking about how benign and malignant tumors are differentiated from one another. Now, the term cancer, whenever it is brought up as a diagnosis, tends to ring um, alarm bells for everyone, and not without cause, because the diagnosis of cancer really is scary. Okay, and this often causes a lot of emotional turmoil to the patient, on top of the physical suffering that comes with um, a mass somewhere in your body and associated uh, aggressive treatments associated with the diagnosis. Now, it must be it must be recognized though that not all cancers are death sentences, okay? And not all tumors are cancers, okay? Some tumors are very curable, whether benign or malignant, okay? So benign tumors, no problem with that. You can always remove them. Um, and there are also malignant tumors that can be very curable. However, others can be very fatal. It's also it was also um, worth mentioning that in the same way that not all malignant tumors are not curable, okay, um, there are also benign tumors that can often cause morbidity and mortality, okay, by virtue that they take up space in certain body cavities. Like for example, um, a benign tumor typically isn't very scary when it's found on the skin, for instance. But once you have a brain tumor that is benign, that can be scary. Okay? So just because it's benign does not necessarily mean it's safe. And just because it's malignant doesn't necessarily mean it's scary. Okay? So we need to identify and delineate what the term neoplasia means. And neoplasia is essentially a tumor. Okay? And a tumor is a swelling, it's an abnormal mass. Okay? The term neoplasia comes from uh, comes from the Greek words that literally means a new growth. Okay? And the study of tumors is known as oncology. Okay? Now, neoplasia is said to be an abnormal growth of tissue. Okay? And the growth of that tissue is not coordinated with the growth of the normal surrounding parenchyma or surrounding tissue. So its growth is independent of that. Nitubo lang siya og kalit. Okay? And um, the tumor persists. The tumor remains, or it continues to grow even after you remove the stimulus that caused the growth. Okay? So essentially, a tumor is a mass of tissue that continues to keep on growing, even if you removed the inciting na stimulus that caused it to grow. So it has become independent of um, the control mechanisms for cell growth. Okay. Now, neoplasia can be divided into two, or if you want to be more technical about it, they are divided into three. you have benign tumors and malignant tumors, and somewhere in the middle, you have intermediate tumors. Okay? Benign tumors will remain localized. Okay? They will not spread. And because of the fact that they cannot spread, they can easily be removed by surgical means. And in most cases, patients generally survive. However, it must also be noted that this is dependent on the site where the tumor occurs. If the benign tumor occurs um, in an area that is amenable to surgical excision or surgical removal, then of course it's not too much of a problem. However, not all sites of the body are easily accessible. So, for example, the brain is not accessible. Um, Certain parts of the abdomen are not easily accessible. So even if you have benign tumors at these sites, it may not necessarily follow that they will have the same prognosis. Okay. Malignant neoplasms, on the other hand, do not respect boundaries. They do not respect boundaries. They invade surrounding tissue, and in the process of invasion, they also destroy the associated tissue. They may also spread either through the blood or through the lymphatics and the lymph nodes to um, reach very distant parts of the body. And if not treated, malignant neoplasms are typically deadly. Okay? And between benign and malignant tumors, you also have a new classification known as intermediate tumors. And intermediate tumors, you have two requirements. It's either the tumor is locally aggressive, okay? It invades adjacent spaces, but it does not necessarily metastasize. Okay, so that's one. Or another group of intermediate tumors are capable of metastasis, but metastasis is very rare. It's not very common in these types of tumors. So again, intermediate neoplasms are either locally aggressive but do not metastasize, or rarely metastasizing. Okay, and tumor cells have two basic components. Just like all the other tissues, you have parenchyma, which are the cells that make up the body of the tumor, and the stroma, which is the connective tissue compartment composed of supportive tissue and blood vessels. Now, it is important to note that um, it is not necessarily the parenchyma or the main body of the tumor that is the most important. Both are equally important because there is interaction between the parenchyma and the stroma necessary for that will dictate the behavior of the tumor. Okay, so the parenchyma is the main body of the tumor or the main tissue of the tumor, and depending on what makes up the parenchyma, the cells that make up the parenchyma, it will dictate the classification, the naming system, and the behavior of the tumor. Okay? So, if it comes from glandular origin, then you call it adenocarcinoma. If it comes from um, neoplastic proliferation of blood vessels, you call it an angiosarcoma. Okay? So, the parenchyma is the main body of the tumor. The stroma, on the other hand, is the supporting tissue, and it contains connective tissue and the blood supply. Okay? And there is crosstalk, as mentioned, between the stroma and the parenchyma because each compartment may secrete substances that facilitate the growth and invasiveness of the entire tumor. Okay? So, this picture shows us a picture of an adenocarcinoma. This looks like an endometrioid adenocarcinoma. This is a malignant tumor of the endometrium of the uterus. So here you see glands. But what's weird about this is the glands are fused um, and they look funny. Okay? The nuclei are elongated instead of circular. And if you take a look at the surrounding tissue, it's actually invading into the smooth muscle of the uterus, into the myometrium. So this tumor is malignant. It's invading into the underlying myometrium. So this is an adenocarcinoma. So this is a high power magnification. So you can see the glands, okay, and you can see the stroma, okay. The glands make up the parenchyma. The stroma is this, the area in between, the connective tissue in between. Now the gland looks funny because it is irregular. The nuclei shows atypia, okay, which means to say that it looks funny. There are differences in sizes and shapes of the nuclei, and you actually see a nucleus here undergoing mitosis. Okay, so this is a mitotic figure. So that's the part of the parenchyma. Okay, now if you look at the surrounding connective tissue, this is desmoplasia. You have collagen fibers surrounded by edema fluid. So you can see na parang there is separation of the fibers brought about by the fluid. So this is actually desmoplasia, which is a characteristic that you will find in certain carcinomas. Okay. Now, how do we name tissues? So all you have to do is get the primary stem of the tube of the organ where it comes from, or the connective tissue, and add oma. Okay. So for example, benign tumor arising in fibrous tissue, fibroma. Okay, you typically see this in um, the dermis. You also see this in the ovaries. Okay, benign tumor arising in fatty tissue, fat. So fat is lipid. Okay, lipoma. This is a benign tumor of fat. Cartilage is chondroma. Okay, you see this in the long bones. Smooth muscle. For example, in the uterus, you have leiomyoma. Leiomyo is smooth muscle. Benign tissue arising in skeletal muscle, that's rhabdomyo. Skeletal muscle. Rhabdomyoma, which is a tumor found in the heart. Okay? Now, epithelial tumors, or tumors that are derived from the epithelial lining of glands, of body surfaces, are classified on the basis of course, the cells where they come from, whether they um, come from glands, whether they come from epithelium lining surfaces, the microscopic patterns, and the macroscopic patterns. Okay? Now, benign epithelial neoplasms that come from glands, okay, are known as adenoma, because adeno means gland. If it's a benign neoplasm that forms papillary or finger-like projections protruding from a surface, whether it is seen microscopically or macroscopically, are known as papillomas. Okay? They usually arise from squamous-lined epithelium. So this one is a picture of a thyroid adenoma composed of smaller thyroid glands, but this is well encapsulated. So this is an example of a follicular adenoma. Follicular adenoma. This one is also comes from this is gastric tissue. So this is an example of adenoma. Okay. Now a polyp is a mass that projects above the surface of a mucosa, and it is typically finger-like. It is a finger-like projection, and you see this, for example, in the nose. You see this in the colon. So this is an example of a polyp. Okay? And this is a example of a um, hyperplastic polyp of a colon. Okay? You can have adenomas and papillomas in the body. So, for example, if it arises from the bronchial lining, you call it a bronchial adenoma. If it comes from the renal tubules, you call it a renal tubular adenoma. If it arises in the liver, you call it a hepatocellular adenoma. If it arises from squamous epithelium, na finger-like production is called a squamous papilloma. Now, so those are tumors that arise from epithelial surfaces. Benign tumors arising from epithelial surfaces. Now, you also have malignant counterparts, and whether it's derived from epithelial lining or mesenchymal tissue, like muscle, like fat, they have different names. So, malignant tumors arising in mesenchymal tissue are known as sarcomas. Sarcomas, okay? So, they arise from muscle, fat, cartilage, bone. So if they come from mesenchymal tissue and malignant siya, these are known as sarcomas. Sarcomas are typically found in younger population or very old populations. Okay? Younger population and very old populations. Okay? If it arises from fibrous tissue, this is known as fibrosarcoma. If it arises from bone, this is known as osteosarcoma. If it arises from cartilage, this is known as chondrosarcoma. Okay, so those are malignant tumors arising from mesenchymal tissue. Now, malignant tumors arising from epithelial origin are known as carcinomas. These are what we typically known as cancers. Okay, so if it arises from squamous epithelium, you call it a squamous cell carcinoma. If it arises from the glands of the kidneys, you call it a renal cell carcinoma. Okay? If it arises from the gallbladder, this is known as a cholangiocarcinoma. Okay? The rule that we followed is if oma siya, it's benign, but you need to be careful because there are exceptions to the rule. Okay? Now, if you have malignant proliferations of melanocytes or the melanin producing cells of the skin, you call them melanomas. They sound benign, but they are actually very malignant, melanomas. Cells lining the mesothelium, when they undergo proliferation, are known as mesotheliomas, also very, very aggressive. You also have malignant germ cell tumors of the testes, and you call them seminomas. And malignant tumors of the lymph nodes are known as lymphomas. So, just because they end in omas does not necessarily mean that they are benign all the time. So, there are exceptions to the nomenclature, as is these four. Now, we also have tumors that have eponyms. They are named after people. Most common would be Hodgkin lymphoma, which is one of the more common lymphomas. Okay? Wilms tumor, which is a very aggressive tumor of the kidneys found in children, and Burkitt lymphoma, which is a very aggressive type of lymphoma, either seen in Africans or in AIDS patients. Okay? Now, there are terms that I would like to explain further because this will tell us of the behavior of certain tumor types. First is differentiation and anaplasia. Okay, differentiation and anaplasia. Differentiation is basically the extent or how similar the cells of the tumor um, resemble their normal tissue counterparts. Okay, so for example, if you have a well-differentiated endometrial adenocarcinoma, this means that the cells that make up the adenocarcinoma are very similar in appearance to normal endometrial glands. Okay, so that's differentiation. How close does it resemble their normal tissue counterparts? Okay, so if it's well differentiated, like for example, well differentiated um, adenocarcinoma of the rectum, then that means that the cancer looks a lot like cells of the colon. Okay? Over time, however, as the tumor cells acquire more mutations, okay, they acquire more mutations because they divide and divide. And remember that mutations are random events, but by virtue na sige divide, chances, mas dako ang chances na mag-acquire siya of more mutations na ay sayop sa copying process. Okay? So as they acquire more mutations, they become less differentiated. Okay? From well differentiated, wherein they resemble their normal counterparts, they become poorer and poorer in terms of differentiation. So mas mubati siyag now, the lesser they resemble their normal counterparts. And this loss of differentiation is known as anaplasia. Okay? And if you have anaplastic tumors, if you look at them under the microscope, you will no longer recognize that this comes from that organ. So it becomes very difficult to identify them. And typically, the more poorly differentiated or the more anaplastic your tumor is, the more aggressive it is, the greater the capacity to metastasize, the more invasive it is, and the less the chances that the patient is going to survive because these tumors are also typically resistant to treatment. Now, benign tumors, by virtue na they are benign, always resemble normal tissue. They are well differentiated. But malignant tumors can range from well differentiated to completely anaplastic. Okay? Kung benign, always well differentiated. Kung malignant tumors, it can range from well differentiated to anaplastic. So this picture is an example of squamous cell carcinoma. This is a well differentiated squamous cell carcinoma. Why? Because it resembles normal squamous epithelium. Okay? You actually have an area here composed of distinct material, and this is keratin. So it's like skin, nagpo-produce siya ng keratin, and this area here is known as a keratin pearl. Okay? If you take a closer look at the cells, you actually see projections arising from each individual cell, murasig spike. And these are actually desmosomes. Similar to the cells on the skin, you have desmosomes that anchor one cell to another. And if you take a look at these, you can actually see them in the microscope. And these are known as intercellular bridges. Okay? So this, again, it resembles functionally and morphologically the appearance of normal squamous epithelium. So this is a well-differentiated squamous epithelium. Now, this tumor, on the other hand, looks very ugly. Okay? You can no longer tell that this is from squamous epithelium kasi the cells vary in size from one another. You no longer have keratin production. Okay? And you do not see the desmosomes or intercellular bridges. You cannot tell unless you do further testing to check that it really comes from squamous epithelium. So this is an example of an anaplastic carcinoma or a poorly differentiated carcinoma. So this tumor is also very poorly differentiated, and as you can see here, you have these weird mitotic figures. So you can actually see in the slide that these cells are actively dividing. And my point here is that you can see in the microscope how the tumor cells are behaving. So this is a poorly differentiated carcinoma. We don't really know what specific type because as the name suggests, it is poorly differentiated. But you can see that this is very aggressive by virtue that you see mitotic figures like these in the middle. So very aggressive, very fast ang pag-divide. Okay? Now, in the histologic examination of a tumor, when you look at it under the microscope, you look for pleomorphism, variations in size. Okay? So if you remember the past few pictures, you can see a poorly differentiated carcinoma. Some of the cells really are big, while some are small. So the differences in size and shape is known as pleomorphism. Okay? Now, malignant tumors tend to have high nuclear to cytoplasmic ratio. So the nucleus takes up a larger volume of the cell. So the bigger the nucleus, the scarier it is. The less cytoplasm you have, the scarier the tumor behaves. Okay? And then hyperchromasia, this is the condensation of the nuclear material. We know in mitosis, nagko-condense yung DNA to facilitate cell division. So essentially, that's what's happening here. Mas dark, mas condensed ang nucleus because it's preparing for cell division. Okay? Okay. So let's talk about how fast these tumors grow. Typically, benign tumors grow very slowly, and they are dependent on the blood supply, the hormonal effects, and the location. Okay? So if you have hormones feeding the tumor, it's going to grow. The size as well, where it is located, can, of course, dictate the growth because if the tumor is found in a location na confined, it's not going to grow as much. Okay? Malignant tumors generally grow faster, but it is going to be dependent on the degree of differentiation. Okay? So, as mentioned, mas aggressive, mas mabilis tumubo yung poorly differentiated na tumors or even mga anaplastic tumors. Benign tumors are localized, they do not invade, they do not destroy surrounding tissues, and then they tend to be localized. Okay? Malignant tumors, on the other hand, destroy surrounding tissue, and they are usually not surrounded by a capsule. So this is an example of breast tissue. This is um, adenoma of the breast. Okay, this is a benign tumor. As you can see here, it is well encapsulated. You can see the delineation between normal tissue and the tumor. And if you look at this under the microscope, lobular ang arrangement, more siya nag-circle ang arrangement. So it is well encapsulated. This tumor, on the other hand, is invasive carcinoma of the breast, and you can see this yellow-white material here in the center. Okay, it's poorly defined. Okay, it has irregular borders. If you look at it under the microscope, see, it's invasive. It's creeping into the surrounding tissue and even into the fat of the breast. So this is invasive carcinoma of the breast or breast cancer. Now, metastasis is the development of secondary implants that are not connected to the primary tumor, and usually they are located in distant sites. Okay? So this is a slab of the liver, and you can see metastatic lesions from somewhere in the body depositing into the liver. So multiple lesions. Okay? So this is metastatic carcinoma to the liver. Different cancers, though, have different abilities to metastasize. Some tumors, as mentioned earlier, like yung hepatocellular carcinoma, follicular carcinoma of the thyroid, and renal cell carcinoma, have a great ability to metastasize. However, there are others na even if carcinoma siya, they don't metastasize as often. Okay? Generally, the bigger the primary tumor and the poorer the differentiation, the more aggressive and the more likely the metastasis. Now, metastasis may occur in several ways. Okay? They may spread through lymphatics, and this is particularly true for carcinomas or epithelial malignancies. Okay? Carcinomas or epithelial malignancies usually spread through lymphatics and through lymph nodes. Sarcomas or malignant tumors of the mesenchymal tissues tend to spread through the blood, so faster ang pag-spread, and they spread hematogenously. An exception to this are three carcinomas. We mentioned ng carcinomas usually lymphatics, but there are three that spread through directly to the blood. That's renal cell carcinoma, hepatocellular carcinoma, and follicular carcinoma of the thyroid. They tend to be more aggressive sa metastasis. And another mode of spread is seeding. So, diretso na mag-i-implant siya sa body cavities. And ang most common for this would be mucinous carcinoma of the ovary. So it will spread through the peritoneal surfaces or the intra-abdominal cavity. Okay? So lymphatic spread, as mentioned, they they are favored by carcinomas. So by virtue na there is lymphatic spread, they tend to involve lymph nodes that are close to the organ. So for example, breast carcinoma, they usually involve the axillary lymph nodes or the lymph nodes sa kilikili. Kay dira man mo drain. Okay? Lung carcinomas tend to drain into the bronchial lymph nodes because it's the most regional. It's the one that's most closest. Okay? Hematogenous spread is found in sarcomas. However, they can be found in some carcinomas as well, as mentioned earlier. They typically invade the veins, and sooner or later, they will reach the liver and the lungs because the liver and the lungs are very vascular. Sooner or later, it will reach those areas. Okay. Now, I'd like to introduce a new term, and this is particularly important when we talk about carcinomas. And this term is known as dysplasia. Dysplasia basically means abnormal maturation. Okay, so for example, in the skin, we know that um, you have actively dividing cells in the basal layer. These cells divide and they divide, and as they divide, some of these cells are pushed upwards. And as these cells are pushed upwards, they gain more cytoplasm, they gain more filaments, structural filaments, and over time, as they reach the upper surfaces, they lose their nuclei. And as they lose their nuclei, some of them flatten as they reach the surface. So that is normal epidermal maturation. Um, in colonic epithelium, you have proliferative cells in the crypts of Lieberkühn, and they divide and then they will form the surface epithelium. Okay, so that's normal maturation of the colonic epithelium. Now, dysplasia is said to be a loss of this normal maturation or the normal maturation sequence. Okay, and this is characterized by a loss in the uniformity of the individual cells and their loss of architectural orientation, the loss of what you will see under the microscope as these cells mature. Okay. Now, dysplasia is non-neoplastic. It is not yet a tumor, and it occurs mostly in epithelial line surfaces. As dysplastic cells, as dysplasia progresses, the cells will look funnier. Okay, they will have differences in sizes and shape. They will exhibit hyperchromasia. They will undergo mitosis, and there will be loss of polarity or loss of orientation. Okay, but as I've mentioned, dysplasia is not neoplastic per se. It is not yet a tumor and it is not yet malignant. However, it is a pre-malignant condition. Give it time, and then the dysplasia will lead to further mutations that will remove the control mechanisms for the growth of the cell, and at which point it becomes a malignant neoplasm. Okay? If the dysplastic changes, if the dysplastic changes progress, okay, and the entire thickness of the epithelium becomes dysplastic. Okay, so this is like this is known as carcinoma in situ. Okay. Now, so this picture on the left is normal skin. Now, if you look at the picture on the right, you will have residual normal skin, but you also have this. You will see that the nuclei reach all the way to the top. There are differences in sizes and shapes of individual cells. The nuclei tend to be darker. So this is dysplasia, and it has reached full thickness. Okay? So at this point, you call this carcinoma in situ. It is not yet malignant, but it is the final step before malignancy. Okay, it is the final step before malignancy. The only thing stopping it is the intact basement membrane. If the basement membrane is breached, these pre-malignant cells will become malignant. It will invade into the deeper tissues and it becomes known as a squamous cell carcinoma. Okay? As mentioned, carcinoma in situ is an intraepithelial malignancy. It is still contained within the basement membrane. Okay, and this is only applicable to epithelial neoplasms, okay, epithelial linings. So here, this is carcinoma in situ. It has not yet penetrated the basement membrane. Okay. Now, based on the biologic behavior, as mentioned, you have benign, intermediate, and malignant lesions. So they may be composed of one cell type, or they can be composed of different cell types. Okay. Now, this is an example of fatty tissue, and this is an example of a lipoma. Okay. And this is very well differentiated. Okay, because remember that benign tumors are always well differentiated, and well differentiated tumors closely resemble their counterparts, their normal tissue counterparts. This is an adenoma. This is a fibroadenoma composed of two cell types: the adenoma component, here the glands, and you have this fibrous tissue composed of collagen. So this is a very common benign breast lesion, common in young women. So composed of two cell types, both benign. This is fibroadenoma. Now, this one is a tumor, a very common tumor in the ovaries, where it is composed of um, different cell types arising from different germ cell layers, whether it comes from the endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. Okay, and this is known as a mature teratoma. Okay, so these are usually cystic na lesions. If you open it, na ay ngipon, na ay hair. Sometimes you see thyroid tissue. So different cell types, but they are all benign looking. So this is an example of a teratoma, composed of different cell types arising from the three germ cell layers. Okay. Teratomas are usually found in the ovary or the testes. Okay. Now, a benign teratoma is known as a mature teratoma. However, there are instances wherein it will have carcinomatous components or it will have immature primitive neuroectoderm. Okay? And in which case, it is known as an immature or a malignant teratoma. Okay? Now, a hamartoma is a developmental malformation. Okay? It is not a tumor, it is not a new growth, but it is an abnormal deposition of normal looking tissue in a site where it is not supposed to be. So that is known as a hamartoma. Okay? Normal tissue in a site where it is not supposed to be. Like for example, in the salivary glands, sometimes you will see pancreatic tissue. So that is a hamartoma. Okay? Or in the breast, sometimes you will see abnormal deposition of salivary gland tissue. Okay? In the skin, sometimes you will have salivary gland tissue. So that's a hamartoma. It's an abnormal deposition of normal looking cells. Okay, it's not a tumor. And then a choristoma is a heterotopic rest of cells, a jumbled group of normal cells. So it's a lesion where you have different cell types all looking normal. So nagkasagol-sagol siya na salivary gland, thyroid gland. It's a collection of that. That's a choristoma. Now, for cancers, for malignancies, or for even for benign tumors, it is important that we know what causes it because this will tell us how to prevent the growth of these tumors. It is also important to identify what is common and what is rare because this will help us in the diagnosis. One of our cardinal rules in pathology is you do not think of entities that are not commonly found in that site. So unahin, you always think of the rare lesions first. Okay? You always think of the rare lesions first. Then you think of you think more of the common lesions first before you think of the rare lesions. Okay? And this places an emphasis on early screening and detection methods. Kasi if the tumor has already become aggressive, okay, it might be too late. Okay? So please note that tumors don't just arise right away. Okay? They have been there for a certain amount of time. You just don't detect it right away. So this is the importance of screening and prevention. So in men, the most common would be the prostate. Okay? In females, it's the breast. Okay? So most common is prostate in males. Most common in females would be the breast. However, by virtue that these are very accessible organs and we can routinely perform biopsies on that, just because they are the most common does not necessarily mean that they are tumors that often cause the most deaths. In fact, the most common causes of death in both male and females would be lung cancer. Okay? So this graph shows us um, the number of uh, deaths and the incidence of cancers over the past few decades. And what is striking is the presence of lung cancer. The incidence of lung cancer has risen dramatically, while everything else has either remained steady or decreased in incidence. This is particularly true for males, likely due to smoking. Now, geographic, environmental factors, and even diet can also play a part. So, stomach carcinoma is fairly rare, but for some reason, it's very common in Japan. And it is said to be due to the food they eat, mga smoked food, mga um, raw food, um, mga kinilaw. Okay, so this predisposes you to the development of of gastric adenocarcinoma. Breast cancer is common in women in the West. Liver cancer is very common in African populations. Okay, environmental factors, asbestos, which is a construction material used in ceilings and walls before predisposes you to a tumor known as mesothelioma. So mesothelioma is a tumor of the mesothelium or the lining of the pleural cavities. So what's going to happen is mesothelioma will grow and grow and it will encase the lungs and it will cause the collapse of the lungs. Okay? Mesothelioma, malignant. Okay? Smoking causes lung cancer, multiple sex partners cause cervical cancer, and fatty diets, and especially grilled food, can cause colonic cancer. Age. Now, generally, the frequency of cancer increases with age. Carcinoma tends to be very common during middle age and late age. Children, you usually see hematopoietic, mga sa bone marrow, lymph nodes, and sarcomas sa mga bata. Okay? And usually, if cancer arises in childhood, it tends to be very aggressive. Okay? Now, heredity. Now, please note that while there are genetic predispositions for cancer, these hereditary predispositions that actually give rise to cancer only make up 10% of cases. So it's actually your environment that plays a bigger part. So you've inherited cancer syndromes, you have cancers that run in the family, and you have cancers due to defective repair mechanisms. So inherited cancer syndromes, for example, retinoblastoma. Retinoblastoma is a cancer of the eye. So, kanuni ang mata. Makurot ang mata. It's very aggressive. Okay? Multiple endocrine neoplasia syndrome. So, you will have, for example, men type 1 is associated with pituitary adenomas, a tumor of the brain, um, tumors of the pancreas, and tumors of the parathyroid. Okay? Familial cancers, you have genetic mutations that run in the family, like, for example, the BRCA gene, and they will predispose you to the development of breast and ovarian cancer, okay, BRCA. And these tumors, usually in the normal population that do not have these mutations, typically arise in older individuals. However, if you have these genetic predispositions, they tend to arise as early as 20 years old. And then you also have defective DNA mechanisms. We'll not delve into that, but there are conditions like xeroderma pigmentosum, wherein the mechanisms of the body to repair DNA damage are impaired. Now, finally, we have pre-neoplastic disorders, or disorders will give rise to carcinoma if they are continued or if they are not stopped. So, for example, smokers will develop dysplasia on the bronchial mucosa leading to carcinoma of the lungs. Um, High estrogen stimulation will cause endometrial hyperplasia, which can sometimes lead to dysplasia, leading to endometrial carcinoma. Chronic alcohol abuse will lead to prolonged phases of repair and damage to the liver, which will lead to cirrhosis, and this will lead to hepatocellular carcinoma. Okay, so that ends our topic. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you were able to get something out of it. Thank you.